Welcome back to Hardball. Well, this year alone, legislation to suppress the right to vote has advanced or been implemented in 36 states altogether. And in each case, the voter suppression bills were introduced by Republicans. North Carolina's are the strictest in the country and include voter photo requirements, shortened early voting, and the elimination of same-day registration. And now a federal judge has ruled that challenges to North Carolina's restrictive voting laws won't come to trial until 2015. That means these impediments to vote, all except for the voter ID requirement, which kicks in 2016, will affect the 2014 midterms there. Well, as reported on MSNBC.com, quote, there's little question that the law hits minorities especially hard. In court filings, the Justice Department has noted that blacks make up 23% of the state's registered voters, but 34% of those who don't have an ID issued by the DMV. Studies show black voters in North Carolina are also more likely than whites to vote early, so they're going to get hurt. And now Ohio is about to challenge North Carolina in the voter suppression sweepstakes. Already, the Republican-led House and Senate in Columbus passed a bill that makes it easier to purge voter rolls and reduces the minimum number of voting machines. I just love that terrible thing. Republican Governor John Kasich is expected to sign it. And here's what's coming up. Cuts to early voting, the end of same-day registration, and making it harder to vote absentee. What do Ohio and North Carolina have in common? They're purple, they're swing states, they have Republican governors and Republican-controlled legislatures, and they're making it harder to vote, especially if you're a Democrat. Dale Ho is director of the ACLU Voting Rights Project, and Nina Turner is a Democratic state senator from Ohio, who's running for Secretary of State, a position in which she'd have a lot of say over voting issues in her state. Let me start with Mr. Ho. Tell me about North Carolina and what's going on there. I went to grad school down there. I love that state, but it seems like there's something turning really hard right in the legislature, which is already affecting the university system down there. But tell me about the voting system and this attempt, it seems to me, to reduce the number of black votes down there, especially coming up with a Senate vote for Kay Hagan. They can knock around that Senate seat by simply, it seems to me, reducing the size of the electorate to the Republicans' advantage.
Well, North Carolina passed, as you noted, Chris, the most suppressive voting law last year that the country saw. It may be the most suppressive voting law that we've seen in any state in decades. And in our view, this is a case, an issue that needs to be resolved in advance of the midterm elections in November. North Carolina doesn't see it that way. They want to put this case off until 2015. But if they really believed in election integrity, which is what they say they believe in, then they join us in our sense of urgency, because if a court later decides that this law is unconstitutional or violates the Federal Voting Rights Act, there's no way to undo that election and get people their right to vote back after they've already lost it.
Now, is there a cause for this, a cause of alarm? Is there voting violations in that state, corruption, voting cheating of some kind, vote stealing, whatever, ballot box packing, any significant example of why they have to move so quickly to implement this law?
No, there's absolutely no evidence of any systematic problem of voter fraud in North Carolina. And there's certainly no problem of voter fraud that cutting a week of early voting would address, that preventing students from registering to vote would address, that ending same-day registration would address. So there's no serious problem in North Carolina, and these proposals that they have no rational relationship to any hypothetical problem.
So if somebody goes to school at Greensboro or Charlotte or Chapel Hill or in Durham, at NC Central University there, or one of those schools, they wouldn't be able to vote when they go to school. They have to get in a car or truck and head somewhere home to get back to vote, right? That's the idea of this, to screw them.
Well, they're making it harder for people to vote where they go to school. Now, the law is very clear that you can register to vote and cast a ballot at the place where you live while you're in school. North Carolina tried to make that harder, and some local boards of election tried to make that harder, to no avail earlier this year, and we don't expect them to be able to implement those kinds of changes successfully.
Senator Turner, tell us about what Ohio's up to, and I'm seeing this pattern. You know, we talk about, I do, a lot on this program, because I think sometimes there's most political debate is reasonable. You can argue about the size of the debt. You can argue about tax policy. You can argue about all kinds of things in foreign policy. I don't think there should be a debate on whether you get the right to vote.
I agree with you.
I think that's just out of the bounds of the usual Democrat-Republican fight, and that's why I take one side on this, the right to vote. That's my side. Okay?
I agree with I agree with you, Chris. I mean, there should not be partisanship when it comes to voting. The measure for any elected official should be whether or not what we implement expands and protects the vote. But as you can see in places like North Carolina, Texas, and even Ohio, Republicans are out to crush the demographics. The points that you bring up, Chris, about African Americans, Hispanic, poor people, working class people, these types of bills have a disproportionately negative impact on those communities. And in 2008, for example, in Ohio, 56% of African American voters utilize early in-person voting. And what are the GOP targeting? Early in-person voting, absentee ballot applications, shrinking the numbers of machines, making it easier to purge people from the voting rolls.
Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that, Senator. I'm sorry to interrupt. I was in South Africa for those historic elections in '94. And I watched people, as I've said, it was biblical, the people lining from one horizon to another.
Yes.
But those votes were over in 4 hours. And then I hear about the United States, where we have the best technology in the world available to us, and people waiting 11 hours to vote. I mean, incredible times. It's chilling to think how long people had to stand outside and vote.
That's right.
Then you go to Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, Ohio.
Yes.
And it's a lot of minority people live there.
Yes.
And so what you do, what's the game they play? They take away the voting booths, so you have to walk further, drive further to vote, or what's the game? And longer lines.
They did that in 2004, Chris, which is why a lot of folks here can't understand why they're trying to regress instead of progress. You may remember in 2004, Ohio made all headlines for all the negative reasons.
I remember.
Some people standing in line for up to 11 hours. In Knox County at Kenyon College, 1,300 voters, 2 voting machines, one broke down. The last voter voted at 4 a.m. in the morning. Communities like Huff in Cleveland, people standing outside in the rain for 4 and 5 hours, the same thing in Columbus. Chris, this is deliberate, and that is why everybody who cares about the sanctity of our democracy should be up in arms. We should have a righteous indignation because our country is founded upon one woman, one man, one vote, great equalizer, and we can't stand for this.
And I think Republicans, the good Republicans watching, should say the end doesn't justify the means.
That's right.
You start playing these games just to win elections, that's not going to help you in the long run. Anyway, since the Supreme Court's decision in June to strike down the part of the Voting Rights Act that required pre-clearance, that's Section 5 of voting rights, changes in certain areas, primarily in the South. The following states have already implemented new restrictions. For example, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia have all gone in there. Mr. Ho, tell us about that, where these patterns of, they just jumped it like the Cherokee Strip. Here's land we can grab. Here's votes we can steal. And here we can, they just moved on a dime when it meant the Supreme Court ruled.
Well, the thing is, Chris, it's not just those states that you highlighted. I like to say that voter suppression in the South, or the South is not like Las Vegas when it comes to voter suppression. What happens there doesn't stay there. So when you see proof of citizenship laws that force people to show a copy of their birth certificate when they register to vote in Georgia and Alabama, those laws spread to Kansas and other states outside of the South. I don't know about you, but I don't carry a birth certificate around with me when I'm walking down the street. So these laws are really aimed at preventing voter registration drives. I think there's unfortunately a segment of the of our elected officials who've decided that as the electorate gets more diverse and gets younger, instead of deciding to try to compete for those votes, which is what you're supposed to do in a democracy, they're trying to squash those emerging voices in our electorate. And we don't think that's the best practice for our democracy.
You guys you are two great guests on the show. I'm glad you both made it tonight. I'm glad we're on top of this story. And I promise you, Senator and Dale, we're going to stay on top of it. Thank you so much for coming on. Dale Ho and, of course, Senator Nina Turner of Cleveland. Up next, the latest on the Fox News Santa Claus controversy, courtesy of Jay Leno. And this is Hardball, the place for politics.